Hello, everyone. Welcome back to The Other Side. I am one of your hosts, Jesse Berkey. I am normally joined by my co-host, Caleb Hires. He is not here today, but I do have a very interesting guest with me, and we'll get into that in just a second. If you are not familiar with us, this is The Other Side podcast. This is where we recognize that our Sunday school theology is no longer good enough for today's world in which we live. There's too much ambiguity. We need deeper answers to the hard to reconcile questions, and that's what Caleb and I are offering here. Our format is we take difficult passages and apply them to our everyday lives and offer maybe a perspective you've never heard of before on some of these tough to wrestle with and reconcile passages. We're also talking about very real and practical issues that apply to our lives. We are inviting guests on to talk about relevant topics that you will love, and also taking and answering questions from you all. So if you have questions, make sure you send them in, and we will definitely get those on, as many as we can. So today is a special guest. His name is Dan Kent. He has a book releasing called Confident Humility. Love the title. Great topic, great discussion, and I know you're going to love this. His book is releasing, and I'll mention this a few times, his book is releasing on June 11th, and you can pre-order that on Amazon right now. In fact, go now. Open up another window and go purchase and pre-order this book. You will be blown away. I have read it, and it is amazing. All right, I'm telling you, I'm endorsing it fully. As much as my credibility is worth, I am fully endorsing this book. So without further delay, here is my conversation with Dan Kent. Hey, everyone. So I am so excited to have my next guest join us on the Other Side podcast. I am here with Dan Kent. Dan is an author, a speaker, a preacher. I have seen that he has begun preaching. Actually, I had a chance to listen to your message that you spoke at Woodland Hills, and it was really, really good stuff, man. Really, really good.
That was a thrill.
Yeah, I call him a theologian. He doesn't have that attached to his bio on Twitter, at least, but he definitely is a theologian. He is the host of a podcast along with Greg Boyd called Apologies and Explanations. I'm a huge fan of this podcast, and Dan, might I say, you do an excellent job of keeping Greg on track, on task.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be appreciated for that. That's not easy to do.
Yeah, I was thinking, I was like, man, he is really talented. He keeps him on the tracks. He keeps this thing going forward. So you are also the editor of renew.org, and you are releasing your latest book called Confident Humility, Becoming Your Full Self Without Becoming Full of Yourself. It releases June 11th. It is available for pre-order on Amazon right now. Dan, your title game is quite strong, I must say. Hey. I love that. Confident Humility. The subtitle is great. I love it. Very intriguing. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us here.
It is so cool to be here. So thank you.
Yeah, such a pleasure. Such an honor to have you with us. But I want to say, full disclosure, you sent me an advanced copy of your book, Confident Humility, about a week ago. And I started reading this. My intent was to try to skim through it so I could get out the main points so that, we could have something to talk about today.
Yeah.
But I found myself reading it, and in my skimming, I would find this meat. I was like, holy cow, I can't skim this book.
Oh, and cool.
I had to keep going back. I was like, there's no way I can skim through this book. This is one of those books that it is, I've seen it already I'm about halfway through it. And I have discovered already that it is giving me the reason to think in a way that I wanted to think, to believe in a way that I wanted to believe. And there's been certain books along my own journey that have done this for me. I've always wanted to believe in a God, have good reasons to believe in a God I hoped was real. And there's been some books that have done that for me. And this is a topic in an area that you are really paved some solid ground in this on this subject. So thank you for that. It's great revelation. Thank you for being willing to share that. And my
Well, thanks for saying that. I appreciate how you say that you have these books that have come along to help you believe in things that you want to believe. And that's an interesting way of saying it, because I've had that too, where it's like, it's called good news for a reason, because if it's true, man, it's so good. But at the same time, you don't want to believe it just because it's good. It has to be news. It has to be real. And so you need that as well. And boy, I've had that as well, where you just come across a book. In fact, early on, the first step for me was C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity. It's like, hey, maybe there really is something to this good news. Maybe it's not just good. Maybe it's also news. And that's a good way to put it. I love that. I mean, just really quick, what are some of the other books that you've read like that have helped you believe things that you've wanted to believe?
The Myth of a Christian Nation was one where that book really helped me to understand the love and nonviolence of a God that I hoped existed. So that was one that was pretty pivotal for me. Is there one that is on the front of your mind that was that for you?
Well, the first one that jumps out is The Divine Conspiracy by Dallas Willard. It took me a year to read because I couldn't read a paragraph without sitting in my chair and contemplating for 10 minutes. So, but it's so good. So I recommend that one. And then another one that's kind of obscure is, it's called Connecting by Larry Crabb. And it really helped me understand the idea of the body of Christ and how healing and revolutionary that can be. Because I'm the type of guy, I'm very much like, I like to sit and work on projects in my office alone, and I like to go have fun, but I'm more of an isolator than a social person. So yeah, I could be social at arm's length on social media, but Larry Crabb's Connecting was really helpful for me as well. So sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no. You know what? That reminds me of one thing I did want to say. Because you brought up social media, your humor is very underrated, I think.
Thank you. Don't tell my wife that.
You got some very funny stuff on your Twitter. Guys, folks, go check him out at that Dan Kent, not at this Dan Kent.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah,
social media is tough because it's so hard to keep it from just being media, especially for Christians and people who are leaders. They just want to use it to share what they're selling or what they're doing. And so I don't know. And then other people, they'll use it just to, share, their, insights and wisdom. And that's good too. But if that's all you're doing, then it's not social. And so I guess what I've tried to do is I've tried to engage people more and have conversations, not debates, but like just conversations.
Sure.
And try to use humor. And I don't know if that's the right way to solve the problems of social media, but that's what I do. So yeah.
Don't you know that social media is the number one way to change people's opinions?
Yeah, right. Man, some people think that, I think.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, my experience, like on the same track of, there's been books that have come along that have really given me permission to believe the way I hoped to believe. I can track back to 2008, where I received a very dynamic personal encounter with the Lord. A revelation of his love for me personally, and it completely changed my life. And one of the areas that really affected going forward was my view of myself, my view of what humility is, of what pride is. And I discovered that the more that I came into revelation of God's love for me, the less self-deprecation I wanted to participate in. The less I wanted to feel negative about myself and try to put myself down or make myself seem less valuable than I am. I wanted to live in the fullness that I felt was alive within me. But as you mentioned in the book, and you talk about this throughout the book, the traditional evangelicalism, it puts us in what you call the ditch of smallness and really tries to get us to put ourselves down. And so, like I was saying, to read a book like this where you really lay it out, it's really freeing. And I know that there's going to be many people touched by and set free by what you've written here.
Oh, that's cool. Thank you for saying that. I hope so, man.
Yeah.
Because for me, I mean, I think you really nailed it. You talk about your experience with God's love, and part of my motivation for writing this is that when I really believed, again, coming back to, is it just, does it just sound good, or is it actually good news that we are loved by this God with an unsurpassable love? And when I really believed that that was true, it revolutionized my life.
Mm.
And other people, I see that they hear about God's love and their life doesn't change hardly at all. And I wondered, why is that? And part of it is because they might not really believe it, but another part of it is I think that sometimes people have other beliefs that sabotage God's love for them. And the ditches of the ditch of smallness and the ditch of bigness, I think, are two big ones that can sabotage the power of God's love in their lives.
Yeah, that's good. I totally agree. So what was it? You talked about it a little bit, but why this topic? What was going on in your life when you decided to tackle this and realize the need for
Yeah.
for this?
Yeah, I wish I would have written it 10 years earlier, but I don't know if I would have been ready to write it then. But I think for me, like, and I talk a little bit about this in the book as well, but I kind of was saved. I come from a family of mostly atheists, and I kind of stumbled into this church through the youth group, and I was really attracted to all of these supposedly good news teachings about the reality of the universe and God and all of that. But the church also had this very negative view of human nature, and they really talked about humans being totally depraved in this very utter sort of way, and that spiritual insight and spiritual goodness to them is acknowledging how terrible you are. And there's you get value in that church by giving these little tokens of things like, oh Lord, I am desperately wicked and I could do nothing good, and people will give you amens and nod their heads, and I had a hard time accepting that because they have all these pictures in this church. They have all these pictures of Jesus, and nobody in these pictures looks like they view themselves so despicably. They all look pretty happy to be around Jesus. And I just don't think that Jesus could have drawn the crowds that he drew if he was telling people that they were all despicable. And I just don't think people would have flocked to him like they did. And then at the same time, this was in the early 90s, the self-esteem movement was just gonzo. I mean, it was every day I would go to school, there was new self-esteem stuff. And this view said the exact opposite. It said that our problem is shame, which my church seemed to lead to. And what we really need to do is we need to think highly of ourselves. We need self-esteem and positive thinking. And so I got stuck in these two, between these two forces, one saying that I am terrible and pride is my enemy, and then the other one saying that I'm fantastic and shame is my enemy. And there's really smart people in both of these camps. And so I really felt like, man, one of them has to be true. They can't both be right, but one of them has to be true, because I didn't really think that there was a third option. And then when I got to college, I was in this Life and Teachings of Jesus class, and I had to do a paper, and the topic that I was given was humility, which I was just like, oh, come on, it's such a boring topic, But it turned out to just, this teaching, especially in Matthew 23 verses 1 through 12, it totally revolutionized how I understood not only humility, but how I saw that Jesus was offering something that was a third way between these two ditches. It's just a different view of human nature that humility emerges out of. And like, if you go to anybody in either ditch and you say, hey, I think that humility is the most important thing, people in those ditches will say, absolutely, amen, brother, you're right. The problem, though, is that they each have their own understanding of humility that emerges from those ditches. And so the view of humility in the ditch of smallness is this idea that humility is the opposite of pride, which is just another way of saying that humans are small. And to get more humble, you have to get less proud, and you have to get smaller and smaller and smaller. So, and so the teaching of Jesus just offered something that made just a lot more sense. And I started to see how this kind of can revolutionize a person's life for a lot of reasons. Number one, because the ditch of smallness inevitably leads to shame. And we've seen that because the ditch of smallness has been big in our churches. And look at all the shame dysfunctions that we see in our churches. culminating, I think, in sexual abuse, pedophilia and sexual inappropriate behavior with minors. Those are all symptoms of shame-based sexuality. And then you have the other ditch, which inevitably leads to arrogance. And there's just so many examples, and I share a couple big ones in the book about how arrogance can destroy a person's life. And I really think that shame and arrogance are sort of like these dysfunction steroids that amplify any dysfunction that we have, whether it's depression, anxiety, procrastination, whatever. And so by Jesus saying that, no, humility is based on this different view of human nature, the more humble you get, the less of both you get less shame and less arrogance. So the more humble you are, the less likely you're going to have shame or arrogance. And so if that's the case, the more humble I get, the less power that I have feeding into my dysfunctions. And so it's liberating for that way, and then several other ways as well. But so that's sort of what the aha that I got when I was in college. And this is in the late 90s. And that's why I wish I would have written this in the early 2000s. But, it is what it is.
Yeah, I think that one of the reasons why people feel so trapped, and myself included years ago, is we don't ever consider that there's a third option, like you were saying. There's a third option out there when you're having this discussion. Where does humility fall? Like you said, we always try to fit it in between pride and shame somewhere, and we don't ever consider that there's another option out there. So even though we feel like something should be different, we don't have the words, we don't have the revelation to really camp out in any particular spot. So we just kind of exist in this limbo state. And
that's a good way to put it.
It can be uncomfortable, but discomfort should motivate us to investigate further, and seek the truth.
That's right. And I think that third way too is, and this is what I argue in the book, is that both of the ditches are the same, and that they think that our human nature is either good or bad. And that's what's fundamental to us, is we're fundamentally good or we're fundamentally bad. And I think what Jesus teaches and what Revelation shows us is that we're fundamentally neither good nor bad. We're fundamentally loved. And I think that that's a very different way of viewing human nature, because if you view yourself as fundamentally loved by this infinite God, and you have this unsurpassable love from this infinite God, you are secure in this cosmic sort of profound way. And goodness and badness becomes like this separate thing. And that's why I think the Bible talks about things like, God says, I have placed before you blessings and curses, life and death. Goodness and badness is sort of this opportunity that we have that is separate from our core nature. We can become bad, and we can become good. But fundamentally, we're neither. We're loved. And I think that's kind of that's the third way nature of Jesus's teaching.
Wow, that's so good. It reminds me, I was spending some time with the Lord the other morning, and he was just reminding me that he doesn't try to establish anything concrete in individual circumstances because of the volatile nature of behaviors or circumstances. For example, if I'm coming to the Lord and I'm feeling bad about a particular thing, like God is, in my experience and my understanding, God is not going to try to cheer me up at my core by saying, oh, I'm going to fix this for you, and your next circumstance that I have for you is going to be overwhelmingly good. No, what he does is reminds me that he is my foundation, that he is the solid rock that I'm standing on, and that my anchor is in him and who he is. And while circumstances and behaviors and acts ride the roller coaster like that, he is steadfast underneath my feet. And it reminded me of that when you were talking about so many people think we're either good or bad, but that is so dependent on our behaviors. If you do a good behavior, then all of a sudden you're a good person. If you do some bad behaviors, that means you're a bad person. Well, that's not.
Yeah, there's an insecurity built into that. If that's how you view yourself, you're inevitably insecure. Whereas with God's love, we're perpetually secure. We can't God loved us while we were still sinners. That is, when we were at our absolute worst, God loved us with an unsurpassable love. So we couldn't get worse, and yet we still had this unsurpassable love. And so there's like this unavoidable security in that the ditches just don't provide.
Yeah, and that love, that unsurpassable worth and value that was ascribed to us by God, it should, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it should deter us from entering into the ditch of smallness. Correct?
I think so. In fact, it's interesting because especially because the ditches also are the same. And I argue basically that they're the same, even though they look like opposites. Another way that they're the same is that they assume some type of social hierarchy, that some people are better than others. In fact, shame is when you feel inferior to others, and arrogance is when you feel superior to them. And if we're loved with an unsurpassable love, that means that if God loves me with an unsurpassable love, he can't love you more, because otherwise his love for me would have been surpassable. Which means that if God loves us with an unsurpassable love, we are also unsurpassably equal. And this whole idea of inferiority and superiority makes no sense. And so it kind of helps us see the lie of shame and arrogance. As soon as we have these shameful feelings, or if we have these feelings of superiority, there's this kind of cognitive check that can develop where you're like, oh wait, this must be an illusion, because there is no inferiority, there is no superiority, there is only this unsurpassable equality. And so, yeah, I absolutely think that unsurpassable love should keep us from the ditches.
Yeah, would you say it's possible that, because I think that this could really grate on some people who have been so steered toward the ditch of smallness. And folks, if you wonder why that I keep on, like, I haven't talked very much about the ditch of bigness, because I've been in the church all my life, you know. Right. There's a reason why the ditch of smallness is so, it stands out more than the ditch of bigness, is because I have been led down into the ditch of smallness my entire evangelical career. I call it a career, but or experience. But do you think that it's possible for a person to simultaneously recognize that they are amazing, an incredible person, and at the same time recognize that they are superior to nobody? Do you think that's possible?
Yes, I do think that's possible. And I think, now, if you say an amazing person, it depends on, we would have to define some of that stuff.
Sure.
But let me try to answer like 5 questions that I pick up in there, with one succinct answer, hopefully.
Okay.
I think that the ditch of smallness, the motivation for the ditch of smallness is often really good, because the ditch of smallness tends to take sin very seriously, and the ditch of bigness tends to ignore sin. It tends to just kind of minimize it, which is very, very dangerous. And so the ditch of smallness tends to say, no, we have sin, and sin is extremely corruptive and corrosive and horrible and so forth. And so that's what motivates a lot of people, is that they don't want to minimize the power of sin. And so, but what happens is that the ditch of smallness tends to put sin at the center of their theology. And it shouldn't be in the center of our theology. Jesus should be the center of our theology, not sin. And so what happens is that when you put sin at the center, you start to view yourself through the lens of sin instead of viewing yourself through the lens of Jesus. And it causes all sorts of problems that the book talks about. Now, I agree with you. I spend a lot more time talking about the ditch of smallness because I care mostly about God's people and the church and so forth. And so, and I think that the ditch of smallness has sort of infiltrated the church more than the ditch of bigness has, but not totally, because there's a lot of churches that are very ditch of bigness. Joel Osteen, I think, has made his whole career on integrating theology with the ditch of bigness. And he's all about surrounding yourself with positive people and positive thinking and self-esteem. And that's why he's so hated by a lot of Christians, is because it's so contrary to the ditch of smallness. And And for other Christians, it's like a relief because they recognize the flaws of the ditch of smallness. And here's somebody who's preaching the opposite. Hallelujah. And they're drawn to that because they've been hurt by the shame of the ditch of smallness. But the problem is that they're just wandering into another set of traps. And what I hope to show is that both of these ditches are extremely destructive. And what I also argue is that only when we understand humility and human nature the way that Jesus teaches, especially in Matthew 23, can we have authentic confidence. And confidence, what I say is, it's a belief, or it's like a faith. It's a certainty, or a level of certainty that we have in a skill or an asset that we possess. And so I'm confident in my swimming abilities based on how I assume I can do in the water. I mean, if I assume that I can swim across, the Gulf of Mexico, well, I must be very confident in my swimming abilities. Whereas the ditch of bigness a lot of times wants to talk about self-confidence, like this big global thing. I think that really confidence is just about very specific things. And so I think that a person, like, I listen to Yo-Yo Ma a lot, and if that guy's not confident about his ability to play the violin, then there is no such thing as confidence, and I think that he should absolutely be confident in his ability to play the violin. And he could even say that he's amazing at playing the violin. And, it's not as valuable as Yo-Yo Ma, but I happen to be amazing at driving backwards in a car. And I can go through parking lots, and I just, for some reason, I'm really good at driving backwards. It's sort of a worthless skill, but I'm amazing at it. And I don't think that that's incompatible with humility, because what humility ultimately wants to say is that we are unsurpassably equal. And any asset that we have or any skill that we have, there's nothing that we can do that can jeopardize that unsurpassable equality and that unsurpassable value that we have. And so, yeah, we can think that we're amazing at certain things, and still be humble. In fact, what happens with the ditch of smallness is a lot of times, in order to maintain their humility, they often have to talk down about themselves, and they have to deny their skills. And this is the famous pretty people pretending like they're ugly, and smart people acting like they're dumb, and because they don't want people to think that they're not humble. And it's just, you get in these weird cognitive traps like that, where it's like, just acknowledge that you're good at something. And it doesn't mean that you're better than anybody, because, we think of things like, intelligence and athletic ability and looks and how much wealth you have. And we get fixated on certain things. But man, there's a billion things that we could be better than or less than other people in terms of skills and assets. And so humility is largely, growing into this realization of how complex people really are and how meaningless to our worth these things are. And when you really believe that your worth is invulnerable, then it doesn't matter how bad you are at something. But it also doesn't matter how good you acknowledge yourself to be at something, because if you're the best yodeler in the world, you know that it means nothing about who you are and about your relationship to your brothers and sisters in Christ.
That's so good. And I just wanted to add to that driving backwards, if I ever need a getaway driver, you're going to be the one that I call.
I'm your man. I'm your man.
Yeah, don't sell yourself short. That is not an entirely useless skill. All right.
Yeah. I could have gone a different path, man. When I was in high school, and man, I really liked cheating systems, and I liked stealing from places that I worked at. And I was probably going down a path of becoming some type of criminal, because I just loved outsmarting the man, basically. And so that skill could have come in valuable to me, but then I found God, and God sort of wrecked the whole thing. So, in a good way.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, so that's a good transition to me asking you, you're talking about your youth and when you're growing up, what ditch were you in as you were growing up? What ditch did you come out of?
That's a really good question. I feel like I was trapped in limbo. On one hand, I really resonated with, my mom. She was an alcoholic, and so she hung out at AA, and she had a lot of AA friends, and a lot of these AA people were ditch of smallness people. And I really liked how easy they were to be around, because they were just it doesn't matter if you screw up around them, because they just assume you're all screw ups. We're all terrible. And I really liked that. But at the same time, I also saw that they weren't really effective at life, and they weren't really motivated to do anything with their lives. And so I was really drawn to like people at school who were achievers, and I wanted to achieve, and I wanted to make something of my life. And they tended to be in the ditch of bigness. And so I really did feel like I was trapped in limbo. And I also saw that even though they were achievers, I recognized that their achievement didn't really have anything to do with the fact that they were in the ditch of bigness, because the ditch of bigness claims aren't really based on anything. When you say that, you are wonderful and you are special, there's no good answer to why in the ditch of bigness.
Right.
Why am I special? And I talk about this in the book. I remember in junior high, man, I'm only in like 7th grade, and there's this poster with this athlete, and he's pointing out and he says, "You are special." And even then, as a dumb little kid, I recognized that, well, how does he know I'm special? He doesn't know me. And the assumption, of course, is that everybody's special. And that ruins the whole point of what special is. And so it's just this vacuousness there. And so I recognized the shallowness of the ditch of bigness too. And I just kind of felt like you said, trapped in limbo there between the two ditches. So.
Yeah, that reminds me of I was talking to my father some time ago, and he's a therapist. He's a family therapist and counselor. And
he would love Larry Crabb, by the way. Connecting by Larry Crabb.
Oh, I'm sure.
Came out in the 90s.
Yeah.
Whew. Is he a Christian, your father?
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Oh, man. I would love to hear his thoughts on it.
Yeah, I told him that I was reading your book, and I told him what the title was, and he sent me back, said, "Oh, I don't need a book like that." Yeah. And then, he was just kidding. Yeah, he was messing with me.
That's funny.
I was like, "Yeah, you definitely need this if that's your answer." No, but but funny. He loves stuff like this. He loves books like this. He's a great counselor. He's a great therapist, and he was explaining to me. I was actually asking him, okay, when you have a client in front of you, and you are, because he works for, it's a secular firm that he works for. I said, and you are attempting to affirm somebody's worth and value, and trying to get them to buy in to them being a valuable and worthy person. How do you do that without God? How do you instill that into somebody?
Good luck.
Yeah, because you have to use, if you don't have God, a third party there who's ascribing that worth to you, you have to try to build it on, like you said, something that is going to crumble. It's going to crumble. These things that we try to build our worth and value on, they are temporary, and they will crumble at some point. And so his answer to me was, well, I just have to wait until they open the door and talking about faith, talking about church, and then he's able to go in to some of that. But it's very interesting.
It is. Yeah. And, I've heard a lot of attempts because I've worked in mental health for 20 years, and I've heard a lot of attempts of people trying to establish that grounding of a person's worth. And it's things like, you're just like everybody else, but it's like, they don't like anybody else. They think everybody's a bunch of louses. So that doesn't help either. It doesn't help that you're just like every other lima bean if you hate lima beans. And so, yeah, you need that third party. You need that objective source, and only faith provides that. I mean, there isn't nothing else that provides that. So
yeah. Well, how do you think this revelation of humility and the way the framing of the two ditches, if we really get this, and this really gets down to our core, and we begin to understand this, how do you think that this would impact our relationship with God? How do you think it enhances our relationship with Him?
Man, I think it's tough because, I believe that Jesus is the way, or He's the road, but man, there's a million wrong roads. There's one right road and a million wrong roads. And so as a cop-out answer, I would say it depends on which wrong road you're on, is my cop-out answer. My more serious attempt at an answer, I would say the first couple things that come to mind is it fights against the insecurity of the ditches, because this feeling, if you're focused on being bad or being small, you're focusing on the wrong thing, and there's a lot of instability and insecurity in that, and there's a lot of wasted attention that you're spending on things that just don't provide any spiritual value. If you're in the ditch of bigness, man, it helps you to realize kind of the shallowness of the ditch of bigness's beliefs and how empty they are, and how much richness and depth there is to what God teaches. Example of that would be there. When you're in the ditch of bigness, positive thinking is of utmost importance. And a lot of times that desire for positive thinking comes as a reaction to the ditch of smallness, which is often so negative and talking about humans as being trash and stuff like that. And it's like this feeling of liberation when you can talk positive about people. And, but the problem is that always leads to, I think, oppression, and it leads to arrogance. And so, as soon as you say that, okay, positive thinking is of utmost importance. Well, how do I think positive? Well, it helps if you avoid negative people. And so you start to avoid negative people. And it also helps if you surround yourself with positive people. Well, so now you're just surrounding yourself with positive people. But Jesse, the thing is that none of these writers ever talk about what positive is. Yeah. And so everybody just assumes that we know what positive is. And that's why you have white nationalists and Black Lives Matters people all saying the same thing. Surround yourself with positive people. Mm-hmm. But I guarantee you they're not thinking of the same people. And so what happens is we end up just surrounding ourselves with people who are just like us. And wow. That might make life easy, but you'll never grow. And you'll never get better as a person if you surround yourself with people who are just like you. And so I think that, depending on which ditch you're in, which path you are, there's a million ways that the right road can liberate us from spiritually suffocating paths. Those are just some examples, but.
Yeah. So surrounding yourself with people who think just like, I can't even get that in my own house, man.
Yeah, that's good. Iron sharpens iron, man.
I'm counting a great day when somebody in my own house agrees with me. Like, oh yeah, we're on a roll now.
That's good, man. You're raising shepherds. That's good. So that's cool.
I wanted to ask you, how can this revelation shape how we view others? Like, does it have an impact on the way that we view and interact with others as well?
Yeah, I think, and I talk about this especially in the last chapter on tools, and there's a couple tools that I use to kind of show how this teaching really helps with others. But really, it's interesting because in Matthew 23 verses 8 through 10, Jesus says, "Do not let anybody call you rabbi, so don't be above others." And he says, do not call anyone on earth father, so don't be below others. It's not the titles that Jesus cares about. He doesn't care about rabbi or father because he uses them all over the place. In fact, even in the beginning of chapter 23, he refers to the teachers of the law. And so it's not the titles that he cares about. It's that exaltation. It's like feeling like you're better than, or feeling like you're worse than others. And right in the middle of that, right in the middle of don't be above others and don't be below others, he says, for you are all brothers and sisters, which I think is his way of saying you are all equal. And he says that you are all brothers and sisters. He doesn't say act as if you are brothers and sisters. He says, no, this is reality. The reality is you are all brothers and sisters, which means that this idea that some people are better than others is a lie. It's a delusion. But the problem is that it's hard to see the delusion because we've all been raised in it. We've all grown up in this delusion. And so as we grow into humility, we grow out of this delusion of inequality. And in doing that, that totally reframes how we view other people, I believe. For one thing, we can, and let me just say this, and I've spent 20 years working with delusional people, so I really understand delusional thinking on a firsthand basis. And one thing that you notice is that, man, they get fixated on certain things. And with the delusion of inequality, man, it's the exact same thing, because as soon as you think that some people are better than others, you immediately start to obsess about how good you are. Because if some people are better than others, where do I stand in the hierarchy? That you have to know that. I mean, any person with a brain has to know if some people are better, which one am I? And as soon as you kind of have some sense of where you're at in the hierarchy, the next thing you have to know is, how do I move up? Because there are consequences for being high or low in the hierarchy. And so we become sort of self-obsessed, and we get fixated on certain things that we think matter for who's above who else. And a lot of times right now it's like intelligence and looks and money and stuff like that. In other times in history, it's been power and size and so forth. But the first thing is to believe that, okay, all of these impulses that I have to fixate on these certain attributes, these are all delusional behaviors, because the reality is we are all brothers and sisters and we are all equal. And as soon as you recognize that, hey, I've been living in this delusion, now you can start to change your template on how you view other people. And I talk in the book about the movie A Beautiful Mind, and he this is about a Nobel Prize winning mathematician named John Nash, who was delusional. He had schizophrenia, and he went on medications to help with his symptoms, but then he couldn't do math. So he stopped taking his medications and he could do math again, but he went crazy and they found him like in Europe in a ditch. And so he was trapped where the only thing that made his life worth living was math, but he couldn't do math if he was on the medications. But if he went off the medications, he would go crazy. So he was just trapped. So what he realized was that the only way that he could live the life that he wanted to live was if he could outsmart his delusions. And he started to develop these little tests to test his situations to see if they were real or not. And I think that that's the same situation that we're in. We're born and we're raised in this delusion of inequality, and we need to have some type of tests or tactics that we can apply to our experiences to detect whether or not what I'm experiencing is real or not. And that's what the last chapter of the book is about. And one of those things is just learning how to see people more comprehensively, instead of seeing them for, oh, they're fat, or whatever 5 or 6 attributes we exalt as being really important. Just learning to see that, man, each of us have, 4 million attributes that we could be judged on. And so the idea of fixating on 1 or 2 or 5 or 8 even is absolutely absurd. And those are like little tests that we can apply to help us view people as unsurpassably equal the way they really are.
Yeah. Well, I got to say that one of the ways that the book is impacting me is, and I do have to, on a side note, I am going to have to pay very close attention to the teaching that you laid forth and the groundwork that you put forth about the ditch of bigness, because I think inside of myself, I have a tendency to, when I recognize that something isn't right in my life, I have a tendency to run full speed in the other direction. And sometimes I have trouble finding the middle ground, which is what you're laying out here. So I recognize that in an attempt to get free of the ditch of smallness, I could find myself trapped in the ditch of bigness as well. But one of the things that I'm finding is the contrast that you are laying forth here. It's helping me to celebrate the beauty of Jesus. It's because I'm feeling even more free to recognize it in myself. And I know that contrast is a powerful tool. It's very powerful and when we look at ugliness and we see the beauty of Christ, I mean, it's the beauty of Christ can be amplified. And I think a lot of times that's what we can fixate on. But recognizing the beauty inside of us also amplifies the beauty of Christ. And so getting free of the smallness can help us, and it's helped me to celebrate the beauty that's inside of me, the good things that are inside of me, because that amplifies the beauty of Christ as well. And so it's increasing the beauty of Christ for me. And so thank you for that.
Amen.
Well, Dan, I want to thank you so much for being willing to come on and spend some time with me and the audience here today. It's so good. And I'm going to just, again, encourage you all to go out and get this book, Confident Humility. Pre-order it on Amazon. Becoming your full self without becoming full of yourself. So good. Releases June 11th. Follow Dan Kent on Twitter at Dan Kent. And just listen to his messages, and you want to plug into what he's doing, and God has really given him some deep revelation. And listen to the podcast, Greg Boyd, Apologies and Explanations. It is very, very good. Dan, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Hey, Jesse, thank you so much for having me. And also, thanks for being such a great supporter of Renew. And you always ask really good questions. In fact, some of them might be too good. So, but I appreciate you.
Thank you very much. All right, folks, that's going to do it. Don't forget to leave a review on iTunes, Podbean. We really appreciate that. Thank you so much for all of you who have already left a review. And we'll see you next time on the other side.